It was an ordinary morning in the quiet town of Larchwood when an incident disrupted the calm. I, Graham Hollister, a retired lawman known in these parts for my 4 decades of dedicated service, was enjoying the serenity of my retirement. The peace that I had long hoped for was suddenly shattered by the unexpected sound of my telephone ringing. At first, I assumed it was one of the local agencies checking in on me, but nothing could have prepared me for the bizarre emergency call that followed. In a scene that defied logic, a neighbor, none other than Marina Delacroix, had dialed 911. Her call was frantic and filled with accusations, claiming that I was hacking the wireless network of the community. The idea that I, a retired county sheriff with a long history of service and honor, could be involved in such nefarious activity was as absurd as it was insulting. I calmly answered the call and soon found myself explaining over the phone that I was not only a law-abiding citizen but a former officer of the law, a retired guardian of public order. Marina's tone was hysterical as she accused me of tampering with what she considered sacred territory, the community's shared wireless connection. She insisted that my actions were not only illegal but a blatant invasion of her privacy. I listened patiently, my mind racing to understand how a simple refusal to share what she perceived as a communal resource could escalate into a full-blown crisis. With measured words and an even tone, I reassured the dispatcher that there was no wrongdoing on my part and that I had never tampered with any network. By the time the call concluded, I was left with a mixture of disbelief and a deep sense of foreboding. The absurdity of being accused of cyber mischief, especially when my hands had long since hung up the badge and gun, was almost too surreal to accept. As I set my coffee cup down and gazed out at the quiet streets of Larchwood, I couldn't help but reflect on the changing times. Technology had woven itself into the fabric of our daily lives, but with it came misunderstandings and misplaced suspicions. The call, trivial as it might seem in the grand tapestry of life, marked the beginning of an unforeseen conflict. I knew that Marina's actions would not be an isolated incident, they were likely the spark that would ignite a series of events challenging the very notions of community and responsibility in our small town. In that moment, I resolved to maintain my composure and dignity, determined to let truth and experience guide my response to whatever was coming next. Since my retirement, I had eagerly embraced the quiet life in Larchwood. My days were spent tending to my garden, reading in the warm sunlight by the porch, and enjoying the respect of neighbors who knew me as a steadfast protector in my younger years. However, the peace I cherished was abruptly disturbed by Marina Delacroix's unwarranted intrusion. Marina, a spirited and sometimes contentious local resident, had always made her opinions known. Yet nothing could have prepared me for the sheer audacity of her behavior that day. It began with that notorious call to emergency services, the call that accused me, Graham Hollister, of hacking into the community's wireless network. I was dumbfounded by her baseless claim, but I soon learned that this incident was only the opening act in her relentless crusade. In the days that followed, whispers about the incident spread like wildfire through Larchwood. Neighbors, who once greeted me warmly, now exchanged furtive glances and uneasy nods. It was as if my decades of service and reputation had suddenly been overshadowed by Marina's dramatic allegations. Despite my attempts to clarify the misunderstanding, Marina's anger seemed to grow, and she appeared determined to disrupt my long-awaited peace. I found myself confronted not only by the ripple effects of that absurd call but also by Marina's persistent efforts to impose her own version of community order. She began making public statements about how our neighborhood should be protected from those who misuse the community's resources, conveniently naming me as an example. The frustration I felt was tinged with sadness. This was a man who had dedicated his life to upholding the law, now forced to defend his honor against unfounded claims. Each day, as I strolled through the familiar streets of Larchwood, I felt the weight of Marina's accusations. The quiet glances of those who once admired my service now carried a trace of skepticism, as if Marina's story had somehow rewritten the truth of my past. Yet, even amid the turmoil, I remained determined to live my life with integrity. I continued my routine, tending to my garden and offering a respectful nod to passers-by, quietly confident that the truth would eventually prevail. The disruption of my retirement was more than just an inconvenience, it was a stark reminder that even in retirement, one's reputation and past deeds could be called into question by the unfounded actions of a single individual. I resolved to address the matter head-on, to demonstrate that honor and truth were not easily tarnished. And so, while Marina's antics stirred controversy and drew unwanted attention, I prepared myself for the challenges ahead, steadfast in my commitment to the values I had carried throughout my life. As the days passed, Marina Delacroix's dissatisfaction with the state of our neighborhood escalated into organized chaos. Determined to assert her misguided authority, Marina took matters into her own hands by forming an unofficial neighborhood committee. I, Graham Hollister, watched with increasing disbelief as she set out to impose her personal rules on our once cohesive community. Marina's newly formed committee was a motley collection of like-minded residents, individuals who, for various reasons, found solace in Marina's dramatic vision of order. They convened in a cramped community room at the local recreation center, where Marina, assuming the role of self-appointed chairperson, issued violation notices for the most trivial of infractions. These citations targeted everything from the angle of a mailbox to the brightness of a porch light. It wasn't long before whispers of her authority began to circulate, accompanied by an air of baseless self-righteousness. I found the situation both absurd and disheartening. Here I was, a retired lawman with a storied career of service and justice, and now a local agitator was attempting to rewrite community norms without any legal standing. Marina's claims were as flimsy as they were public, and her unauthorized committee was a blatant affront to the established order of Larchwood. Despite the chaos she was causing, I maintained my calm, knowing that truth and experience would eventually outshine her theatrics. I attempted to reason with Marina privately, hoping to steer her away from this misguided path, but she dismissed my words with a cold, dismissive glare. To her, I was nothing more than a relic of a bygone era, a man clinging to outdated ideals in the face of modern challenges. The more she pushed her agenda, the clearer it became that this was not a simple matter of misunderstanding but a calculated effort to seize control over our community's affairs. Her actions began to ripple through Larchwood. Neighbors who once trusted in the natural order of our community now found themselves caught in a web of conflicting directives and arbitrary rules. Some residents, swayed by Marina's forceful personality, started to carry her violation slips with a mixture of fear and resignation. Others, however, whispered behind closed doors about the absurdity of it all, questioning the legitimacy of a committee that had no legal foundation. I resolved to document every detail of Marina's campaign, a record of the baseless citations, the unauthorized meetings, and the growing division within our neighborhood. It was not merely about protecting my own reputation, it was about safeguarding the integrity of Larchwood. In my eyes, the community deserved a return to reason, not the whims of a self-styled enforcer. As I sat back in my study that evening, reflecting on the day's events, I felt the weight of responsibility settle upon me. The battle lines had been drawn, and it was clear that the conflict was only beginning. I braced myself for the challenges ahead, determined to uphold the values of fairness and decency that had defined my years of service. Even as Marina's committee cast a long shadow over our neighborhood, I held on to the hope that truth and reason would ultimately prevail. Frustration had reached its boiling point. The ongoing power struggle in Larchwood was now centered on an issue that many would consider trivial, a shared wireless network. For weeks, Marina Delacroix and her ragtag committee had demanded unfettered access to what she deemed a community resource. My repeated, polite refusals to share the wireless network's password had become a recurring source of contention. In response to the incessant pressure, I decided it was time to take a stand. One quiet afternoon, after one too many futile attempts to appease Marina and her followers, I made a decisive move. I accessed the network settings on my modem and changed the password to a simple yet pointed message. Marina, stay out. This small act of defiance was intended not merely as a security measure but as a clear signal to those who believed that I, Graham Hollister, would yield to unwarranted demands. The change did not go unnoticed. Almost immediately, murmurs spread through the neighborhood. Neighbors, who had grown accustomed to the tension between Marina and me, now found themselves drawn into the unfolding drama. Marina, upon discovering the new password, was incensed. In a public display of outrage, she accused me of sabotaging the community's connectivity and, worse, of undermining her authority. The issue, which should have been a mundane matter of network management, had now become a battleground for pride and principle. I remember the look on Marina's face when she confronted me outside the local grocer's, a mix of disbelief and simmering rage that spoke volumes. In her eyes, my action was not only a personal slight but a betrayal of the communal trust that she believed was sacrosanct. But for me, it was a necessary measure, a way to assert my right to enjoy a peaceful retirement without being bullied into compliance by an overzealous self-appointed enforcer. The fallout was swift and far-reaching. Social media buzzed with comments and hashtags that mocked the absurdity of the situation, and local gossip columns picked up the story as a symbol of the growing rift in our once united town. Neighbors who had always admired my years of service began to see me in a new light, no longer just a retired lawman, but a man standing up for his rights against tyranny, no matter how trivial the issue might seem. Despite the mounting public attention, I remained steadfast. I knew that my action was not intended as an act of malice but as a firm response to the constant barrage of demands from Marina and her committee. It was a declaration that, in my home and in our community, decisions would be made on the basis of mutual respect and common sense, not by the whim of a self-styled ruler. As the days passed, the controversy over the wireless password continued to simmer. I received calls from longtime friends expressing both support and concern, while Marina organized meetings to protest what she labeled a direct attack on communal rights. Yet, even amid the clamor, I continued with my routine, determined to let my actions speak for themselves. I took extra care of my garden, read quietly on my porch, and allowed time for the dust to settle, confident that truth and reason would eventually prevail. That afternoon, as I sat back with a cup of tea, I reflected on the nature of power and defiance. What had started as a simple change of a password had now become a microcosm of larger issues, of personal autonomy, community governance, and the right to live free from undue interference. I resolved to keep a careful record of every development, every comment, and every action taken by Marina's committee, convinced that the evidence of my principled stand would one day tip the scales in favor of fairness. In the end, my decision to change the wireless password was a catalyst, a small but significant act of resistance that would shape the course of events in Larchwood for weeks to come. And while the battle over connectivity was far from over, I held on to the belief that standing up for one's rights, even over something as seemingly mundane as a Wi-Fi password, was essential to preserving the dignity and freedom of our community. The tension reached a new height when Marina Delacroix, incensed by the password change, escalated her campaign in a manner that bordered on the theatrical. In a move that seemed designed to garner public sympathy and defame my character, Marina once again dialed emergency services. This time, she claimed that my actions constituted a deliberate cyber attack, a fabrication meant to paint me as a modern-day digital outlaw. On that fateful afternoon, as the sky over Larchwood began to darken with the promise of an approaching storm, I received notice that emergency responders were en route. I maintained my composure as I prepared to face yet another round of unwarranted allegations. When the responding deputy arrived at my modest home, his eyes quickly caught sight of my familiar features. Recognizing me as Graham Hollister, the retired lawman known throughout Larchwood, the deputy could not hide a wry smile. His laughter, warm and tinged with incredulity, spread through the gathered onlookers like wildfire. Marina's plan had backfired spectacularly. Rather than rallying support for her cause, her accusations now left her the subject of ridicule. The deputy's amusement was not born out of malice but rather from the absurdity of the situation. A retired sheriff being charged with cyber crimes in a town that valued tradition over technology. Yet, despite the momentary levity, I knew that the stakes were high. This was not just about a misplaced 911 call. It was about defending my reputation against a barrage of falsehoods. In the ensuing hours, as news of the incident spread throughout Larchwood, opinions were sharply divided. Some residents, initially sympathetic to Marina's concerns about communal security, began to question her motives. The deputy's light-hearted reaction, combined with my steady demeanor, painted a stark contrast to Marina's frantic and baseless claims. I made a point to speak calmly with anyone who would listen, reiterating that my actions were neither malicious nor unlawful, but a simple assertion of my right to manage my own network. Despite the deputy's dismissal of the charges, Marina refused to back down. Instead, she doubled her efforts to portray me as a menace to our community's safety. Flyers appeared on lampposts accusing me of digital sabotage, and social media accounts dedicated to her cause posted exaggerated accounts of the supposed cyber attacks. Yet, every time I was confronted with these accusations, the evidence of my decades of honorable service spoke for itself. Neighbors who had once admired my commitment to justice began to rally behind me, expressing their disbelief at the audacity of the charges laid against a man who had served with honor. As the controversy deepened, I found myself at a crossroads. I could either engage in a war of words with Marina and her supporters or let my actions speak louder than any accusation. Choosing the latter, I continued with my daily routine, confident that the truth would eventually dispel the clouds of misinformation. I even began to document the unfolding events, gathering statements from those who had witnessed the deputy's reaction, the community's responses, and the increasingly erratic behavior of Marina's campaign. By the time dusk fell over Larchwood that day, it was clear that Marina's attempt to frame me as a cyber criminal had only served to highlight the absurdity of her claims. The laughter of the deputy and the murmurs of support from longtime residents became a chorus of evidence that I was, in fact, a man of integrity caught in an unnecessary battle. And though Marina's campaign of accusation continued to simmer, the seeds of doubt had been sown among the townspeople, a doubt that would ultimately pave the way for a more measured and rational response to her antics. In the end, the incident was a turning point, a public repudiation of Marina's fabricated narrative. It reinforced my resolve to remain steadfast in the face of unfounded allegations and to let truth, not theatrics, define my legacy in Larchwood. No sooner had the cyber attack farce subsided than Marina Delacroix sought new ways to unsettle the peace of Larchwood. Fueled by humiliation and an unyielding desire to assert control, she turned to petty harassment. The next phase of her campaign was marked by the deliberate dissemination of false citations, accusations concerning everything from the brightness of porch lights to the supposed misuse of the community's wireless network. Marina's tactics were as varied as they were baseless. Overnight, residents began to notice flyers and handwritten notes posted on doorways, each one alleging that I, Graham Hollister, had violated a host of absurd neighborhood regulations. These citations detailed fines for infractions that defied common sense. Claims that my porch lights were too bright and that my supposed cyber activities had caused interference with neighbors' devices. It was clear that Marina had taken it upon herself to enforce an unofficial set of rules, despite having no legal standing or community mandate. As I discovered these notices, a mix of exasperation and quiet determination welled up within me. I had always believed in the importance of community order, but not at the expense of truth and fairness. Marina's relentless barrage of false claims was not only an affront to my character but also a dangerous precedent that threatened to undermine the integrity of our neighborhood governance. I realized that if I did not take steps to counter these fabrications, they would continue to erode the trust that had been built over generations. I began a thorough process of documenting every spurious citation and every incident of harassment. I visited neighbors who had received similar notices, gathering their accounts and explaining the baseless nature of Marina's assertions. In private conversations, many admitted that they were perplexed by the sudden enforcement of arbitrary rules that seemed designed solely to target me and disrupt the natural order of Larchwood. This collective skepticism provided a glimmer of hope amid the chaos. Determined to expose Marina's tactics, I reached out to a local community newspaper. I provided them with copies of the fraudulent notices, along with my own detailed account of the events. In interviews, I explained that my decades of service as a lawman had always been guided by fairness and respect for the law, and that these new citations were nothing more than an expression of one person's vendetta. The story soon gained traction, and the public began to question the legitimacy of Marina's claims. Meanwhile, Marina's harassment took on a more personal tone. I received anonymous phone calls and subtle messages left on my doorstep, each one dripping with hostility. The tone was consistently the same, a call for retribution against a man who dared to defy the unwritten rules of Marina's self-appointed regime. Despite these challenges, I remained resolute. I continued to record every incident, confident that the weight of evidence would eventually silence the baseless accusations. In the midst of this turmoil, I also made a point of reaching out to community leaders. I organized a small meeting with concerned residents, during which I laid out the facts and provided clear examples of Marina's unfounded enforcement of rules. The meeting was a turning point, as it allowed many to see the absurdity of the situation firsthand. What had started as an isolated act of harassment had grown into a broader effort to maintain order by any means necessary, even if those means were steeped in misinformation and personal vendettas. That day, as I returned home after the meeting, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. The campaign of petty harassment, though deeply irritating and disruptive, had inadvertently galvanized a segment of the community to stand up for reason. I resolved to continue my documentation and to work with local authorities to ensure that any future actions by Marina or her accomplices would be met with a swift and just response. Ultimately, the false citations and petty harassment were not merely personal attacks against me, they were a challenge to the principles of transparency and fairness that had long defined Larchwood. I knew that overcoming this phase would require patience, perseverance, and the collective support of a community unwilling to be swayed by unfounded accusations. And so, with every false notice pinned to a door and every hostile message recorded, I inched closer to a future where truth would once again prevail over personal vendetta. The simmering conflict in Larchwood reached a critical juncture when I, Graham Hollister, discovered that Marina Delacroix had taken her vendetta one step further. It wasn't just about unauthorized committees or baseless citations anymore. Marina had unlawfully tapped into the communal water supply, drawing water from our neighborhood well without permission. The revelation struck me as both an egregious violation of community trust and a dangerous overreach of her self-appointed authority. I first became aware of the illicit well tap when a concerned neighbor approached me with evidence of unusually low water pressure and erratic readings from the communal meter. Upon investigating, I found clear signs that water lines had been tampered with, and the evidence pointed directly to Marina's handiwork. It was an act that transcended petty harassment. It was a direct assault on the basic resources that sustained our community. Fury and disappointment welled within me, tempered only by the calm resolve that had defined my years of service. I realized that if Marina continued down this path, the integrity of our entire community would be at risk. I decided then that a measured, yet unequivocal response was necessary. In a calculated act of retaliation, I set out to disrupt Marina's unlawful operation by targeting one of her most visible assets, her garden hose, which she used to water her ornamental shrubs. Late one evening, under the cover of darkness, I approached the property discreetly. My intention was not to cause irreparable harm, but rather to send a clear message: actions that undermine community welfare would be met with decisive countermeasures. I connected my hose to the source and, with careful precision, flushed it with water laced with a foul odor. An unmistakable symbol of protest. The stench that followed was immediate and overwhelming, a pungent reminder that Marina's actions had consequences. The next morning, as the community awoke to the unpleasant aroma wafting through the neighborhood, reactions were swift and varied. Some residents, initially shocked, began to see the incident as a form of poetic justice. Longtime friends and neighbors commended the action, acknowledging that Marina had crossed a line that could not be ignored. Others, however, expressed concern over the escalation of tensions, worried that this might set a precedent for further retaliatory acts. Marina's reaction was swift and furious. Outraged by the public display of defiance, she ramped up her campaign, accusing me of vandalism and deliberate sabotage. Flyers were distributed, and social media posts circulated accusations of misconduct. Yet, despite her vehement protests, the evidence of her illicit tapping, and my measured response to it, was difficult to refute. I took no pleasure in the confrontation, but I understood that sometimes one must stand up to protect the collective good. I meticulously documented the incident with photographs, video recordings, and witness statements from neighbors who had observed the aftermath. Every piece of evidence was carefully preserved, not only as a defense against Marina's inevitable legal challenges but also as a testament to the community's resolve to safeguard its resources. As days turned into weeks, the incident gradually began to shift public opinion. Neighbors who had previously remained neutral now voiced support for holding Marina accountable for her actions. The well tap was recognized as a serious breach of community trust, and calls for formal intervention from local authorities grew louder. Meanwhile, I continued to focus on de-escalating the situation, engaging in quiet discussions with concerned residents and community leaders to ensure that retaliatory measures did not spiral out of control. In my heart, I hoped that this episode would serve as a turning point, a moment when the community collectively decided that illegal actions, regardless of their scale, would no longer be tolerated. The confrontation over the well tap was not just about water, it was about respect, responsibility, and the unyielding determination to protect what was rightfully ours. That night, as I sat on my porch reflecting on the day's events, I realized that while Marina's actions had disrupted our community, they had also ignited a spark, a call for justice that resonated deeply with many of Larchwood's residents. And though the path ahead would be fraught with challenges, I resolved to see this struggle through, confident that in time, truth and fairness would prevail. Not long after the well tap incident, Marina Delacroix escalated her campaign by forming a mock homeowners association, HOA. Determined to impose her arbitrary rules on Larchwood, she declared herself the de facto enforcer of a host of nonsensical regulations. In a hastily organized public meeting in a borrowed community hall, she introduced a slew of policies that ranged from curfews for lawn watering to bizarre restrictions on the use of outdoor lighting. I, Graham Hollister, observed these developments with a sense of measured concern. While Marina's antics were both frivolous and legally baseless, they threatened to sow further discord among residents already weary of constant conflict. I took it upon myself to document every detail of her self-proclaimed authority. Armed with a notepad, a digital recorder, and the support of several like-minded neighbors, I began gathering evidence. Photographs of signed violation slips, copies of fake fines, and video footage of Marina's impassioned speeches. Throughout the meeting, Marina's rhetoric grew increasingly incoherent. She cited imaginary bylaws and demanded obedience to rules that made little sense to anyone familiar with municipal governance. The residents' discomfort was palpable, and many began to question the legitimacy of her so-called HOA. My documentation captured every moment, ensuring that the truth would be known when the time came to challenge her authority in a formal setting. By the time the meeting concluded, it was clear that Marina's mock HOA was nothing more than a desperate attempt to exert control. Yet, the damage had been done, her actions had stirred up old resentments and deepened the divisions within our neighborhood. I resolved to compile all the evidence and prepare for a confrontation with local authorities. The record I created would serve as a robust foundation to debunk Marina's claims once and for all. In the days that followed, I shared my findings with community leaders and a local journalist. The story of Marina's fraudulent HOA spread quickly through Larchwood, sparking public outrage and calls for intervention. Many residents, once swayed by her dramatic proclamations, now saw the absurdity of her actions and rallied behind the demand for legitimate governance. I maintained a steady presence throughout the process, ensuring that every piece of evidence was meticulously catalogued. That evening, as I reviewed my notes and footage, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. Marina's mock HOA was more than just a nuisance, it was a symbol of the broader issues of power, control, and the misuse of authority that had long plagued our community. With each new piece of evidence, I grew more confident that a thorough investigation would dismantle her fraudulent operation and restore order to Larchwood. The tension in Larchwood reached a boiling point when, during a scheduled HOA meeting convened by Marina Delacroix, I, Graham Hollister, found the opportunity to expose her lack of legal authority. The room was packed with residents, many of whom had grown disillusioned by Marina's self-aggrandizing proclamations and arbitrary rules. As the meeting began, Marina took the podium with all the air of a seasoned dictator, her voice raised in proclamations that bordered on the absurd. I listened intently as she laid out her new regulations, dictates that touched on everything from curfews for porch light usage to the proper arrangement of garden gnomes. The audience, initially silent, began to murmur among themselves as the inconsistencies and lack of legal basis in her claims became increasingly apparent. Seizing the moment, I rose from my seat and, with measured calm, addressed the assembly. I detailed my decades of service, my unwavering commitment to upholding the law, and the incontrovertible evidence that demonstrated Marina's unauthorized use of power. Using the documented evidence I had meticulously gathered over the preceding weeks, I projected photographs, read out excerpts from the fabricated violation slips, and presented video clips of her previous unauthorized meetings. The reaction in the room was immediate. Many residents expressed shock and disapproval, and murmurs of support began to swell in my favor. I explained that the mock HOA was not recognized by any municipal authority, that its rules were entirely arbitrary, and that the so-called penalties were nothing more than attempts at intimidation. As I continued, I emphasized that true community governance could only be established through transparent, legally sanctioned processes. I pointed out that Marina's actions were not only disruptive but potentially unlawful, and urged the assembled residents to demand accountability from local officials. The turning point came when several influential community members, emboldened by the evidence and my testimony, rose to support my position. Their words, combined with the clear documentation, left no doubt in the minds of the majority that Marina's mock HOA was nothing but a sham. In the ensuing discussion, it became clear that the residents no longer wanted to be governed by fear and arbitrary rules. The overwhelming consensus was that Marina's organization be dissolved immediately, and that formal channels be established to address any genuine community concerns. The meeting ended with a resounding vote to disband the fraudulent association, and a commitment by local authorities to review the matter further. I left the meeting that day with a profound sense of relief and accomplishment. The public exposure of Marina's lack of legal authority had not only ended her farcical reign but had also restored a measure of order and confidence in Larchwood's communal institutions. The residents now had a clearer understanding of the importance of legitimate governance, and I was reassured that, in time, truth and justice would prevail over tyranny and misinformation. In the aftermath of the tumultuous events that had rocked Larchwood, the final chapters of Marina Delacroix's campaign of misrule unfolded with dramatic clarity. The community, once divided by Marina's false claims and arbitrary regulations, now rallied together in a unified call for justice. Legal action was swiftly taken when it was revealed that Marina had imposed over $4,700 in illegal fees through her mock HOA. The lawsuit, a long-anticipated culmination of her fraudulent activities, forced her hand and ultimately led to the sale of her property. I, Graham Hollister, watched as the wheels of justice began to turn. The legal proceedings were thorough and uncompromising, laying bare the many ways in which Marina had abused her self-proclaimed authority. Court documents detailed the numerous violations and the baseless fines imposed on unsuspecting residents. As the case unfolded, it became evident that Marina's actions were not just a personal vendetta against me, but a systematic attempt to profit from chaos and fear. The trial garnered significant attention in Larchwood, and residents who had once been divided now found common cause in the pursuit of fairness and transparency. Local media outlets reported extensively on the case, highlighting the absurdity of Marina's claims and the strength of the community's resolve to hold her accountable. I was invited to speak at several community events, where I recounted the events with a focus on the importance of civic integrity and respect for the law. Following the verdict, Marina was forced to sell her house, and the community slowly began to rebuild trust. I, too, sought solace in returning to a quieter life. Though the controversy had disrupted my retirement, it ultimately reinforced the values that had guided me throughout my career, a steadfast commitment to justice and the welfare of the community. The neighborhood began to heal, and despite the lingering scars of conflict, there was a sense of renewal in the air. As the dust settled, I reflected on the long and arduous journey that had brought us to this point. The struggle had not been easy, and the battles had been fought on multiple fronts, from digital disputes over a wireless password to the illegal tapping of our communal well. Yet through it all, the truth had emerged victorious. Larchwood was now a community defined not by fear and division, but by a shared commitment to accountability and fairness. In the end, I returned to the peace I had once known, grateful for the support of neighbors who had stood by me during the darkest days. Though I continued to monitor community affairs from afar, I took comfort in knowing that Larchwood had learned a valuable lesson in the importance of legitimate governance. The legacy of these events would serve as a reminder for future generations, that no one is above the law, and that even in the face of baseless tyranny, the truth will eventually prevail.